The Center for Prophetic Imagination exists to nurture prophetic witness. And really what that means is that there are people out there who have a stirring in their heart that they know things are wrong. And they have a suspicion that going deeper into the source of life, nurturing their own spirituality, will help them not only feel closer to God or more spiritually nourished, but will help them be able to lean into the problems of the world. And so for people that are feeling that tension, who want to have one foot in radical action and one foot in deep spirituality, we've created a program for you. All of our programming is for you, and we want you to come and be a part of what we're doing. Hi, I'm Mark Van Steenwyk, Executive Director of the Center for Prophetic Imagination. There's 2 billion Christians in the world who theoretically worship Jesus, but the idea of following him is a little bit harder to swallow. And we look at different figures throughout history who do that, who centered things on following Jesus' example. But today, it's a hard question. What does it mean to do ministry, to do life the way Jesus did it? And when I looked through the Gospels, I noticed a sort of pattern of 5 primary movements. I saw this mostly in Mark's Gospel, but it's there in the other ones, where you have Jesus being baptized and going to the wilderness as preparation, which is going to the wilderness was preparation for almost all of the prophets. That's why Jesus is in the tradition of the prophets. Then he begins to do this stuff, casting out demons, healing the sick, and making proclamations that offended people. That's his work of compassion and confronting the structural injustices of his day. Then you see Jesus going with his disciples up to the Mount of Transfiguration, where he gets all glowy, but really the thing that happens is the perception of his disciples shifts, and they see Jesus for who he really is. A great revelation. Then he comes down from the mountain, goes to Jerusalem, has his confrontation with the temple money changers, and then he occupies, kind of like Occupy Wall Street, occupies that space for a week until they sentence him to death, basically. And so then the final movement, his death and his resurrection. So you have that 5-fold pattern in Jesus' ministry. His preparation in the wilderness, his works of compassion and provocation, his Mount of Transfiguration experience, his time in the temple where he cleanses it of the money changers, and then his death and resurrection. Those 5 movements can be 5 movements for our own preparation into the way of life that Jesus patterns. And so that's why we've patterned our certificate in prophetic spirituality after the life of Jesus in those key 5 phases. In our first intensive, we learn about the prophetic tradition with a particular emphasis on Jesus' wilderness experience. Exploring the prophetic tradition in Scripture and today, this intensive is 1 part study of the theme of the prophetic tradition in Scripture, and 1 part self-exploration of the ways our imaginations have been shaped by empire. In our second intensive, we look at global suffering through Jesus' model of compassionate ministry, studying those traditions that understand that compassion means to suffer with. We will learn what a Christ-centered solidarity looks like today. Our third intensive centers on Jesus journeying to the Mount of Transfiguration. Using the Transfiguration as a lens for understanding the contemplative life, we will learn from the Christian mystical tradition as we cultivate contemplative practices. When we perceive the world, ourselves, and our God differently, our actions change the world. Our fourth intensive reflects upon Jesus' subversive action in the temple. How might we approach resistance in the same way? Bringing the examples of Jesus and the Hebrew prophets into creative dialogue with modern tactics of disruptive witness, participants will discern, organize, and enact a direct action together. Our final intensive is patterned after Jesus' journey of death and resurrection. It brings together practices of spiritual discernment and wilderness rites of passage, culminating with a 3-day solo fast. Through this intensive, students will grapple with the nature of their own personal vocation in light of the world's great needs. Two online courses supplement these intensives with deeper study into the history of Christian radicalism and the nature of oppression and imperialism that shapes our consciousness in this world. Yeah, there's a few Bible words that weird people out, like the word prophet. We assume that if we use the word prophet, we use it just for any political figure, like so maybe Noam Chomsky is prophetic. Or if you're kind of in the more of the charismatic tradition, you use prophet in the supernaturalist sort of sense of someone who predicts something that's coming. But that tradition of the prophets, we see through the Hebrew prophets, Jesus refers to John the Baptist as the greatest among the prophets, and then John baptizes Jesus, and then Jesus calls us to follow him. So we're in the tradition of the prophets. Prophets were both mystical figures, people whose way of seeing the world was saturated with God, but they were also political figures because they always spoke challenging words to people in authority and power and called the people back to a healthy way of human flourishing. So that's what a prophet today is. Anyone who, anchored in an awareness of the presence of God, calls people to human flourishing. That's the prophetic tradition, and that's not something that just happens to you. You can prepare yourself and become better equipped to not only be mindful of God's presence, that's what contemplative practice does, but also challenge people, whether it's through, literal preaching or through actions and witness, to call people into human flourishing. Together, we will embark on a journey of transformation so that we see and engage the world differently, so that, like the prophets, we can become people of action who are deeply rooted in the presence of God.